We are back for the round 5 feature match. This is Michael Kohanim. I'm here with Robert Boyajian. We have for our round 5 feature match Jeff Jones against Michael Albanese.
Yeah, and it looks like Jeff lost the roll, had to go first, but he opens up with about ideal as a hand as you can against Necros. But even though Albanese has Maxi here, Jeff is only going to make one special summon. But here he's able to search a beast and send a core. Ultimately, the construct, he's going to send Squamata to send core, but he's able to set up an Annoy Talis potentially for next turn. But it looks like he's choosing not to do that by adding the Squamata. But because he opened Mistake and Lancia, his opener was so good that I don't think it necessarily matters.
Yeah, his deck appears to be specifically constructed to beat Necros decks. I'm unsure whether he knows he's playing against a Necros deck at this point, but if he is, if he does know, he would know he's in good shape because of it. He has a Mistake already in his hand, which he can now set face down. He has 3 copies of Mistake in his deck, which can often be used to completely stop Necros decks in their tracks because they're unable to search for the cards they need. He's also using the new Shadow Fusion monster, Annoy Talis, which stops the opponent from special summoning monsters with their spell and trap cards. So that essentially shuts down all of their ritual summon possibilities. In addition, he's using Artifact Lancia, which can stop Kaleidoscope. Not Kaleidoscope.
It can stop Necros Mirror and Trishula.
Necros Mirror, as well as Necros Trishula, which is often a huge play. We've already seen Mistake have an impact here. Albanese summoned Manju of the 10,000 Hands, tried to search for a card, and Mistake shut it down.
Yeah, exactly. The Lancia also can be used to in response to Necros Cycle when they try to use Djinn Releaser rituals, because it forces them to resolve the cycle without banishing the Djinn Releaser. So that's also very, very good.
Yeah, the Lancia is interesting because it doesn't counter as many cards as you would want a card to stop, like the way Mistake searches for all stops all searches, but its impact is tremendous. When your opponent activates a ritual spell card expecting to summon a certain monster, and then you mess with what they're able to banish to summon that monster, they can end up messing up their own hand, tributing monsters that they hadn't planned to tribute. And essentially, not only does the card counter or stop the ritual spell card, but it also causes it to backfire.
Exactly, and if they're not wary of the opponent using Lancia, they can really get punished for it. Like, for example, they could have to tribute 2 Manju or Senju to summon a Valkyris or something similar when they were planning on summoning a Trishula basically for free. Here, Jeff is going super aggressive, dealing as much damage as he can. This is why Mistake is so good, because he's stifling what Albanese can potentially do, putting out as much damage as he possibly can, as fast as he can, to put him on a clock. And he's going to be able to set up an Annoy Talis next turn because he fused away a construct and can add back core, and he already has an El Shaddai fusion set. I'm not necessarily sure it was correct for him to use the El Shaddai fusion from his hand because Albanese saw him add back an El Shaddai fusion and set it. So even though that was a minor misstep, I don't think it's the biggest deal. I'm also pretty sure this is just game on board because it's 28 from the first construct, 28 from the second one, and then 24 from the combined attack of Falco and Squamata, but because he had to deal with the Manju, that's 1,400 less. So then Albanese is just going to be at 1,400. And then, yeah, so here Jeff's going to add back the Shadal core, which will set up Annoy Talis for the following turn. So it's super, super strong.
Yeah, it does look pretty good for him. We talked a lot about him stopping Albanese's plays, but in this duel, it looks like he's just taking an aggressive approach and trying to beat him quickly without really establishing control to try to stop him from playing anything.
Yeah, well, the single mistake seems to do enough.
Yeah, the single mistake certainly is.
Yeah.
He decided he didn't need the Lancia.
Yeah, this is pretty unfortunate. Here, Albanese might consider summoning or setting the Dance Princess in order to put a Necros monster in his graveyard for Valkyris, but even then, Jeff can use the El Shaddai fusion to remove the attacking monster from play when Albanese uses Necros of Valkyris, which will then cause it to resolve without effect. So then he can still continue to attack for game that turn. So I don't think there's really a way for Albanese to get out of this situation. He just simply didn't draw an out to Mistake, and then he couldn't beat it. He has 2 Mystical Space Typhoons in his main deck, so he did have outs, but I guess he just couldn't find them in time.
Looks like he'll just set a card to each zone. That's all he could do.
Here, I think Jeff is going to... Oh, no, he just uses the Shadal core to summon it. I was going to say he might use El Shadal Fusion to using the Construct and the Squamata to send a dragon to destroy the Shadal dragon to destroy the back row during the end phase. But I think he's just trying to set up a kill with Star Heater here.
Yeah, he tunes his Falco with his Shadow Core to summon Star Eater, and that's it.
Yeah.
And Albanese couldn't handle it.
Yeah, pretty decisive game 1 victory.
Yeah, that was pretty quick.
It's kind of entertaining because even though Jeff lost the roll, the fact that he went first is the reason he won, because he was able to set up with mistake before Albanese was even able to do anything, and Albanese chose to go second.
That's true. That game would have been very different had Jeff gone second,
Yes.
because Albanese would have had the ability to use pretty much all the cards in his hand on his first turn.
Yeah.
I don't know if he would have, though, because I don't know if he knows what Jeff's playing. Well, now he does, obviously, but
Yeah.
at this before, I don't know if he did. And frequently, Necros duelists are reluctant to start playing cards and commit cards to their field and graveyard, as that leaves them vulnerable to Trishula.
Yeah, I agree. I think both players are actually fairly familiar with one another, and the fact that they both played the same decks at the previous Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series would probably put them on the fact that they're probably playing the same deck.
You're probably right. They're both veteran players.
Yeah.
They both follow the game closely, but you can always run a different deck at the next tournament.
Yeah. It's also interesting there because even if Jeff went second, he still had Lancia in his hand, and although Mike drew the Jin, which is the rare situation where Lancia won't be able to catch it because he can just cycle it away from his hand rather than banishing it, the Lancia would have given Jeff a good way to just deal with whatever Albanese might do.
Yeah. Jeff has a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of cards that counter Necros decks. A lot of cards that just shut them down so they can't do anything. Let's see if there's anything in the side deck that will be relevant going into games 2 and 3.
Anti-spell fragrance from Jeff is most definitely going to be his key, like just an additional trap card that can completely halt what Mike Albanese is doing, as well as 2 copies of Shock Trooper of the Ice Barrier, or Shock Troops of the Ice Barrier. Shock Troops is very, very good against the Necros deck if you're on the Shadal side, because you can use it to destroy an opposing Jin Ritual monster, and then add a second copy from your deck to your hand to then follow up a fusion play into a Noyatilis. So
In Albanese's side deck, we have 2 copies of Fire Hand, 2 copies of Ice Hand, Mystical Space Typhoon, 1 copy of Mystical Space Typhoon, 1 copy of Breakthrough Skill, 1 Vanity's Emptiness, 3 Mind Crush, 3 Royal Decree, 1 Fairy Wind, and 1 Artifact Lancia. I'm thinking the Mystical Space Typhoon might come in, and I don't know what you think about Royal Decree, but that looks like a possibility given
Royal
the 3
Decree is most definitely a
mistakes.
possibility, but I most definitely think he's going to put in the Fire Hands and Ice Hands. Those cards are very, very good against the Shadal variants that are trying to use continuous trap cards to beat Necros players. Fire Hand gives you a very efficient way to deal with Shadal and Noyatilis, and can bring out Ice Hand that will then deal with a mistake or whatever. If he starts on Ice Hand with a Noyatilis up, he gets to destroy whatever back row and then Fire Hand away the Noyatilis, and then get another Ice Hand, which he can then potentially exceed with. If you look at Albanese's extra deck, this is kind of a big difference between what's considered standard and what's considered not. So he's using 1 copy of Stellar Knight Ptolemaeus and 1 Stellar Knight Constellar Diamond. So what he's going to do with the Ptolemaeus is try to bring it out and then just move to main phase 2 to make the diamond. But that also means that he can't make the Ptolemaeus turn 1. Because if he makes it turn 1, he can't go to his main phase 2 to overlay the diamond. And he hasn't included any other Stellar Knights in order to put under his Xyz materials. So the only way he can make a diamond turn 1 is if he makes the Ptolemaeus with 3 materials, which is very, very rare for a Necros deck to do. So if he used something like a Stellar Knight Delteros in his extra deck, he could just make it with 2 materials, set up a third, and then if Jeff plays a Shadal Fusion or maybe even some of the Mathematician, he can respond by summoning Diamond, which will then cause Jeff not to be able to send any cards from his main deck to his grave. And he could negate a Dark Monsters effect once because he'll have 1 material left over. But with this way, Albanese, it's not necessarily greedy, but he'd rather dedicate his extra deck spots to other cards. But whenever he summons Diamond, it's just going to have 3 materials, but he can't do it on his first turn. I think Albanese is also probably going to bring in the single copy of Breakthrough Skill. It's just a flexible way to deal with the Noyatilis just in case. He can Breakthrough Skill like a Mathematician when it's first summoned or a Construct maybe, and then use the second part of Breakthrough Skill to stop a Noyatilis later.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility.
I also think he might bring in Fairy Wind if he doesn't bring in Royal Decree. Yeah, he drew both a copy of Breakthrough Skill and Fairy Wind. So we'll see. Jeff's hand has 2 decent hand traps in it. Usually you want to save your Effect Veiler or your Artifact Lancia, specifically Effect Veiler, for Necros of Trishula. You don't normally use it on a Senju or a Manju, for example, because their hand could still very well be likely good enough for them to Trishula you after you negate that. So you want to negate the card that is going to hurt you the most, which in most of the cases is Necros of Trishula. But because he has the Lancia, he has much more freedom in what he negates with the Effect Veiler, because he still has the Lancia to fall back on.
Right.
And
So
here, Jeff is going to summon Mathematician to send Squamon and send Beast just to try to dig for another card, because his hand isn't dense with trap cards or anything. He draws a copy of Debunk, which we saw in his side deck, but I didn't necessarily think he would bring in. But Debunk is also not very bad.
Now, why would you go for the Squamata there to send the Beast to the grave instead of directly to the Beast?
Because Mathematician can only send level 4 lower monsters, so that's why they have to send Squamata.
Of course.
See here, Jeff is going to let the Senju resolve. There's also the fact that Albanese might have a Book of Moon or a Book of Eclipse to respond to the Effect Veiler with, which would then mitigate it. So he might necessarily want to be as trigger happy with the Effect Veiler. We'll wait for something bigger. We'll see what happens, though. This is still pretty good, though, because neither Effect Veiler nor Lancia stop the Ptolemaeus into Diamond play. And it looks like Albanese might be able to make it, depending on the rest of his hand. He has a Valkyris, a Necros of Valkyris, and a Shred Strategist of the Necros, so he's probably going to go for that instead. But just the fact that he could potentially go for Ptolemaeus is pretty strong. And yeah, Jeff's just going to debunk just to trade, hoping that Albanese's hand isn't that great.
Okay. So now, Clausulus, that stays in the graveyard, correct?
Yes, because it activated in the hand, yeah. Debunk only banishes cards that activate and resolve in the same place. So because Clausulus moves from the hand to the graveyard, it's not in the hand for Debunk to banish. What's interesting here is that even though Jeff traded the Debunk for the Clausulus effect, he could have potentially just Effect Veilered the Senju and then debunked whatever other searcher that Mike might have had, and then still had the Lancia for the Trishula if it came down to that.
That's true.
Because, yeah, see, the debunk itself completely stifled Albanese on what he could do, but Jeff could have just used his Effect Veiler on that. And then if he would have Effect Veilered and Mike would have chained something like Book of Eclipse, right? So using the Book of Eclipse, giving Jeff another draw during the end phase with Mathematician, and then debunking the Clausulus that he forced to resolve with Book of Eclipse, Jeff would have been so far ahead. So I'm not exactly sure why he debunked the Clausulus there, but I'm sure he had a good reason. Maybe something he wanted to save the Effect Veiler for that was better, and he still just wanted to trade the debunk.
I mean, the Effect Veiler in the hand is also safer, typically, than the debunk on the field. Because the debunk on the field could always be vulnerable to stuff like Royal Decree, Mystical Space Typhoon, and a bunch of other cards that came in here. The Effect Veiler in his hand, I think it makes sense to hold on to it, because that's not going anywhere.
That I can see your point, and I'm sure Jeff considered that line. One thing we considered Mike citing in Royal Decree before, and I don't really think he did, and that's because Jeff still has access to Shadal Dragon. So at any point that he fuses with a Squamata or can search it with a Hedgehog or summon a Mathematician, he can just blow away Royal Decree. Yeah. So let's see what Jeff's doing here. I think he's gonna summon a Construct. He might have just been saving the Effect Veiler as another light to fuse with because he had BLS already.
That would also make sense.
Yeah.
So, yes, there are a lot of benefits to the Effect Veiler.
Yeah. See here the breakthrough. This is exactly what I was talking about before. You just break through whatever you can to trade away the breakthrough, and then you save it in your grave for a No Utilus. So like in this case, the Construct effect would have just given Jeff, another draw with Beast, sending Falco, getting something relevant, and then Albanese just shows, I'm going to not worry about that. Put the breakthrough seal in the graveyard, ready for a No Utilus when it comes out. This is the same game plan Jeff had before. He's just going to try to press for as much damage as possible. Albanese is going to consider using Valkyris here, but because he let so many other attacks through, he might as well just save it for a bigger attack later. But it might have been correct to do it there because Jeff already had used El Shadal Fusion, and El Shadal Fusion is typically how the Shadal player plays around Valkyris. So because he already used it, he could have just saved the 2800 there. But at the same time, it makes sense for Albanese not to use it because he might be trying to find a ritual spell to use to summon it.
Right. If a Shadow player attacks with a monster and the opponent tries to block the attack with Necros and Valkyris, the Shadow player, of course, could chain El Shadow Fusion, get rid of his own monster, and then Valkyris is powerless to stop the attacks.
Completely correct. What's also interesting about that play, though, is that, as I said, he could have been just trying to find any ritual spell to use, but if he does it like that, he can also just use Cycle to bring back the Valkyris, which is interesting, but it might be that he wants to use as many ritual spells as he can that turn, and if he's doing it like that, he probably wants to try to Bryonic and Trishula, because he can potentially Bryonic away the Construct, which would prompt Jeff to respond with El Shaddai Fusion. And then he can follow up with a Trishula, not knowing Jeff obviously has Lancia. But he's just trying to sequence as well as possible. See exactly here. He searched out the Cycle first, and he's just going to summon the Valkyris, whereas he could have just summoned it from his graveyard. So
what's the advantage of this play?
It gave him the option where he could draw any ritual spell and just be able to summon Valkyris. Like, it could have been the Kaleidoscope, it could have been Necroz's Mirror. And it could just be that the other play's a little too greedy in that, I'm going to draw a Cycle, because even though this play costs you 2,800 life points, it still puts you in a situation where you have more draws that are better for you. So I think that's ultimately why I did it. See, he's going to try to set up a Trishula play here, which Jeff's pretty happy to see.
So it looks like he has Royal Decree and Ice Hand in his hand. So he definitely put a lot of cards in from his side deck.
Yeah, he's just going to get caught by the Lancia, though. So it's unfortunate. He's going to probably banish away the Cycle he used and probably Necros of Unicorn from his grave to search Necroz's Mirror. So then he can banish the Shrit to summon the Trishula.
Now, if Jones were to discard Lancia now, Albanese would be unable to banish the ritual spell from his grave, correct?
That's correct, but
is that ever worthwhile? Or
sometimes, but you have to, usually when you're doing that, you can win the game the next turn. Because having your opponent just pass the turn versus them trying to use resources to, do something or accomplish something is a big deal. Also, the fact that if Lancia catches him on Trishula, Jeff gets to see his hand, he gets to see exactly what Albanese has. He can potentially punish him by forcing him to summon another ritual monster. See here, I'm pretty sure, Jeff's going to prompt Lancia.
There's the mirror.
Mike's just going to show him his hand. No way to summon anything. Now Jeff knows about the Ice Hand, so he has BLS. So all he has to do is use his El Shaddai Fusion so he doesn't have a spell trap for Mike to blow up with the Ice Hand.
Yep.
And then he can probably win the game.
He has this duel pretty much locked up.
Yeah.
What is Albanese at right now?
33. So Jeff could also just banish the
Ice Hand with Blackluster Envoy.
That's probably the best play because it also lets him play around Valkyris, even though it doesn't matter because he doesn't have it. But it also lets him play around cards like Book of Eclipse. But yeah, I initially didn't realize how low Mike was. Yeah.
So.
Well, that was a
quick match.
Yeah. That just shows, even though Necrons may be the most represented, most powerful deck in the field, you could easily adjust your deck to compensate for that. Exactly what Jeff did. And Shaddai specifically are able to run so many hand traps like this, like 3 Effective Ale or 2 Lancia, 3 Maxi, because you can just fuse them away.
It's true. Necros decks are extremely powerful, but they have a lot of vulnerabilities, and a lot of players in the tournament this weekend are aware of those vulnerabilities, and instead of running a Necros deck, which is one of the most popular decks this weekend, they're running decks that exploit those weaknesses and can just use a card here and there to completely shut the opponent's deck down.
Yeah.
That's what Jeff Jones did in this particular match. He started the first duel with Mistake, and that completely destroyed Albanese, who was unable to pretty much do anything. And then we saw the same thing in Duel 2, different cards.
But similar situations.
Similar situation. He used Artifact Lancia to stop Necro's Mirror, and other tech cards like that just rendered him unable to really come back with his Necros deck.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention about, a lot of decks would hinder their other matchups by maining cards like that, like Maxi's Effective Ale and Lancia. But as I was saying about Shaddai just being able to use them as fusion materials, it makes it so you have these cards that are so powerful against Necros, especially that you have access to them game 1. But then against other decks, you're just using your Lancias to make El Shaddai Construct. and similar things. So it's never that bad to draw.
Yeah, we spoke earlier about whether the Necros deck, not Necros, whether the Shadow deck is better with or without the Star Seraphs, and which would be more popular, which is going to be more played moving forward. And, we said the verdict is still out on that. We don't really know. Clearly, Jeff Jones chose to forego the Star Seraphs.
For exactly this reason.
Yeah, for better or for worse. Yeah. But he makes it look pretty good when, he draws the cards that are in their place, the tech cards.
Yeah,
the Lancia, the Effect Veilers, and summons Construct with those by using El Shadow Fusion or Shadow Fusion, even without the Star Seraphs in those fusion summons.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to note, Jeff Jones is running 3 copies of El Shadow Fusion, but only 2 copies of Shadow Fusion.
Well, we saw that duel, how good El Shaddol Fusion is as a way to set up Anoyatilis during your opponent's turn, and as a ways to dodge Valkyris and just get a quick play version of the effect. And a lot of the time, you're not going to be able to capitalize with Shaddol Fusion's effect when they have an Xyz monster, because the only time they're going to have that is when you Effect Veiler a Lavalval Chain, or catch them when they activate Necros Cycle and you respond with Lancia after they've had a Lavalval Chain. And once duelists know that you're using Necros, they typically won't go for that play anyway. Or once you're using Shaddol, they typically won't go for the Lavalval Chain play anyway.
Right.
So Shaddol Fusion loses additional value.
Right. It's really interesting, though, because when Shaddolls first became competitive, one of the main reasons people wanted to use the Shadow deck is because Shadow Fusion was so powerful. If your opponent had any monster summoned from the extra deck on their field, you can activate Shadow Fusion, you fuse 2 monsters from your deck, you get both of their effects if they're Shadows, you summon a new fusion monster to the field, the fusion monster has an effect. And now, with the scene changing and Necros becoming one of the most dominant decks, players are reconsidering the value of Shadow Fusion, because Necros decks don't summon as many monsters from the extra deck and keep them on the field for an opponent to use Shadow Fusion against. So against those decks, Shadow Fusion typically just functions as a polymerization, or a card that fuses monsters together, whereas El Shadow Fusion is the same thing but quick play. So
I completely agree with what you're saying.
In that sense, it's strictly better. Clearly, against another matchup, a deck that's more dedicated to summoning monsters from the extra deck, like Burning Abyss, or even clipboard decks, some Pendulum summon from the extra deck, and Shadow Fusion could be powerful against them. But it's clear from Jeff's deck list that he built his deck to beat Necros decks.
Yeah.
And that's what he did here.
Yeah, I think the only super relevant matchup that the Shaddol Fusion is used in now is actually the mirror match, because having Shaddol Fusion in your deck forces your opponent to tribute away their constructs and other extra deck monsters for Shaddol Beast so they don't get blown out by a full power Shaddol Fusion. And because of that, you still want access to a couple copies, but Burning Abyss has been pushed so far out because of the dominance of the Necros deck and how effective that deck is against it. And Quillfort doesn't usually use the extra deck either, like you mentioned. So, while you need a couple copies for the mirror match, because you might want to search it with a Hedgehog at one point or another, or send it with a construct to add back when you tribute for Beast, I think Jeff is right in only using a couple copies rather than a full 3.
All right, so both of those duelists were 3-1 before. Jeff Jones is now moving on with a 4-1 record. We did not mention before, also, he was a VIP duelist as well. So he's in the special seating area.
Got started off the day with 2 buys. Nice.
Started off with a 2-0 record and gets his private water station where he can drink as much water as he wants.
Hopefully... I was going to make a joke about Anoyatilis needing water, but it seems unnecessary.
I think Anoyatilis has enough water.
Yeah. Or the fact there's just so many Necros, there's a lot of water. But enough for bad jokes.
You can never have enough bad Yu-Gi-Oh jokes.
Yeah, I mean...